Every tank ever built put the engine in the rear, not because engineers universally agreed it was the best position, because it was the position that emerged from the first tank designs in 1916 and was never seriously challenged after that. Engine in the rear, transmission driving forward to the tracks, gun in the turret at the front, the crew in the middle, that was a tank. Every nation that built tanks after World War I built them that way. Britain, America, Germany, Soviet Union, France, Japan. The layout was so universal that it was not even discussed as a design choice. It was simply what a tank was. Israel read the literature, studied the designs, fought in 3 wars using tanks built exactly that way, and then, in 1974, they built their own tank and put the engine in the front. The international defense establishment called it wrong. NATO engineers said the front-mounted engine would make the vehicle slower, harder to maintain, and worse in combat. They were not entirely wrong about the engineering compromises, but they had not fought the Yom Kippur War. Israel had, and what Israel had learned in October 1973 changed every assumption about what a tank needed to do. To understand the Merkava, you need to understand what happened to Israeli tank crews in October 1973. Egypt and Syria launched coordinated surprise attacks on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Israeli tank formations on the Golan Heights and Sinai Peninsula were engaged by enemy forces equipped with Soviet-supplied anti-tank missiles, the 9M14 Malyutka, known in the West as the AT-3 Sagar, and rocket-propelled grenades in unprecedented numbers. In the first 3 days of the war, Israel lost more than 400 tanks. In previous wars, Israeli armored tactics had succeeded because Israeli crews were better trained than their opponents, and Israeli tanks were broadly comparable in quality. The Yom Kippur War introduced a new variable: cheap, portable, infantry-carried anti-tank weapons available in quantities that overwhelmed Israeli tank units. A conscript soldier with a Sagar missile could kill a tank that cost 100 times what the missile cost. The Israeli Defense Forces drew 2 conclusions from this experience. First, tank crews were now extraordinarily vulnerable to weapons that could penetrate any armor Israel could put on a vehicle. Second, the survival of the crew had to become the primary design objective, because experienced tank crewmen were a strategic asset that Israel, a small country with limited manpower, could not afford to replace. Every tank design decision that followed from 1974 onward was filtered through one question: does this keep the crew alive? The engine in the front was the first and most radical answer to that question. A tank engine is heavy. The Merkava's Continental AVDS 1790 diesel, later replaced by the more powerful Teledyne Continental AVDS 1796A, weighed approximately 2.5 tons. 2.5 tons of steel and iron sitting between the crew and the direction from which most anti-tank weapons approached. The front of a tank was where rounds came from. If you put the engine in the front, you put 2.5 tons of ballistic mass between the enemy and the crew. The engine became armor, not designed armor, not rolled homogeneous steel, a dense, massive, energy-absorbing block of metal that a shaped charge warhead had to penetrate before it reached the crew compartment. The engineering cost was real. The engine in front meant the transmission had to drive backward through the vehicle to reach the rear sprockets. The drive shaft ran the length of the hull. Maintenance was more complex. The engine compartment was harder to access. The vehicle's center of gravity shifted forward, requiring suspension adjustments. The turret had to be positioned toward the rear of the hull to maintain ballistic balance. Every one of these compromises was accepted, because the alternative was a crew compartment with less protection in the direction where protection mattered most. The Merkava's second radical departure from conventional tank design was the rear door. No tank had ever had a rear door. Tanks were not supposed to need rear doors. You entered through hatches on the top of the turret and hull. You exited the same way. The Merkava had a rear door because Israel had decided that a tank should be able to do things that tanks had never been asked to do. The rear door opened into a compartment behind the engine that could carry 6 infantrymen or 3 stretcher casualties or additional ammunition. In Lebanon in 1982, Israeli Merkava tanks evacuated wounded soldiers from positions under fire. The tank drove to the casualty, opened the rear door, loaded the wounded, and drove out. No armored personnel carrier needed. No separate vehicle exposed to fire. The tank itself became the evacuation platform. In urban warfare, the combination of tank firepower and infantry carrying capacity in a single vehicle proved tactically decisive. Israeli doctrine began integrating Merkava tank companies with infantry in ways that no other nation's doctrine anticipated, because no other nation's tank had a rear door. The Merkava Mk1 entered Israeli Army service in 1979. Combat weight was 63 tons, power came from a 900 horsepower diesel, producing a power-to-weight ratio adequate for the terrain Israel expected to fight in. The main armament was a 105mm rifled gun, the same weapon used by Centurion and M60 tanks already in Israeli service, chosen for ammunition commonality. Secondary armament included a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun and 2 additional machine guns on the turret roof. The armor was a combination of spaced armor and specially designed Israeli steel that had been developed through research into the penetration mechanisms of the weapons that had killed Israeli tanks in 1973. The gaps between armor layers trapped shaped charge jets, disrupting penetration before they reached the crew compartment. The first test came in Lebanon, in June 1982, Operation Peace for Galilee. Israeli armored formations including Merkava battalions engaged Syrian forces equipped with T-72 tanks and anti-tank missile teams in the Merkava Valley. The engagements in the Bekaa Valley produced the first direct comparison between the Merkava and a modern Soviet main battle tank in actual combat. Israeli Merkavas destroyed Syrian T-72s in multiple engagements. Syrian missiles and rocket-propelled grenades struck Merkavas. The crews survived at rates that surprised Israeli commanders who had expected casualties based on 1973 experience. The front-mounted engine was absorbing hits that in conventionally designed tanks would have penetrated to the crew compartment. When a shaped charge struck the Merkava's frontal arc and detonated, it had to penetrate the outer armor, then the engine block, and then the internal firewall before reaching the crew. Many rounds that would have killed crews in Centurions or M60s were stopped by the engine. The tank could be destroyed. The crew walked out of the rear door. One documented engagement in the Bekaa Valley involved a Merkava struck by 3 separate anti-tank missiles. The vehicle was mission-killed. The engine was destroyed. The crew of 4 exited through the rear door. All 4 survived. The vehicle was recovered, the damaged components replaced, and the tank returned to service. In a conventional tank, 3 anti-tank missile hits to the frontal arc would have killed the crew. The Merkava's development continued through successive marks. The Merkava Mk2 incorporated improved armor packages and updated systems. The Merkava Mk3, entering service in 1989, introduced a new 120mm smoothbore gun, a new power pack producing 1,200 horsepower, and significantly improved fire control. The Merkava Mk4, in service from 2004, added active protection systems, the trophy system that could intercept incoming missiles and rockets before they struck the hull. The trophy system, developed in Israel specifically for the Merkava, represented the next logical step in the engine-in-front philosophy. The front-mounted engine had been passive protection. Trophy was active protection. A radar detected incoming missiles. A shotgun-like countermeasure launched to intercept them before impact. Combined with the engine as a ballistic shield, the Merkava Mk4 with Trophy created a survivability envelope that no other tank in the world could match. When Hezbollah forces in Lebanon in 2006 fired large numbers of Kornet anti-tank missiles at Israeli Merkavas during the Second Lebanon War, the results again surprised Israeli commanders, but for different reasons. Some missiles penetrated. Israeli crews were killed. The lesson was that even the Merkava's extraordinary protection had limits against the latest generation of Russian-supplied tandem warhead missiles. The response was Trophy. The Trophy system on Merkava Mk4 in the 2014 Gaza operation and subsequent operations demonstrated complete protection against rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles in urban environments. Every intercept was recorded. Every crew survived the engagements where Trophy activated. The combination of front engine protection and active countermeasures created a vehicle that was qualitatively different from any tank operating anywhere else. Other nations studied the Merkava's design and concluded that their own tank design philosophies were justified by their own tactical situations. The engine and rear design was retained in American Abrams, German Leopard 2, and British Challenger 2 because those vehicles were designed for the Central European battlefield where crew survivability was understood differently. The Merkava was designed for a specific Israeli reality, a small country with limited manpower reserves, fighting in terrain where anti-tank weapons proliferated, where crew survival was not just a humanitarian concern, but a strategic requirement. Every design decision traced back to that specific reality, engine in the front, because crew survival mattered more than maintenance convenience, rear door because wounded soldiers needed extraction and infantry needed transport, spaced armor because shaped charges needed to be defeated, layer by layer. Trophy because the next generation of threats required active rather than passive response. By 2024, over 2,000 Merkavas of all variants had been built. The vehicle serves only with the Israeli Defense Forces. Israel has never exported it. The technologies it incorporates are considered too sensitive to transfer. But the concepts it pioneered, cruise survivability as the primary design objective, engine as ballistic protection, rear access for infantry and casualty evacuation, active protection as a system requirement, have influenced tank design discussions in every major military that has studied the Yom Kippur War's lessons. In October 1973, Israeli tank crews died because the weapons used against them had outpaced the protection designed to stop them. The engineers who designed the Merkava in the years after that war decided that the correct response was not to add more armor to existing designs. It was to question every assumption about what a tank needed to be, and rebuild from the answer. The engine went in the front. The door went in the rear. The crew went in the middle. And for 50 years, that decision has been keeping Israeli tank crews alive in wars that by every calculation should have killed them in the numbers Israel could not afford to lose.